everybody. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm here with a many times recurring guest on the show. In fact, I've had him on for more episodes than any other guest. This will be the 7th time total if you include his one appearance on our other show, Criteria. And he is a poet. He's a philosopher. I had him on in the past to discuss his book, The Vision of the Soul, his verse cycle, The River of the Immaculate Conception, and had him on Criteria to discuss Ingmar Bergman's film Wild Strawberries, which is a really enjoyable discussion. James Matthew Wilson. He is the author of a new book from Angelico Press titled The Strangeness of the Good, which also includes his series of poems, Quarantine Notebook. James, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back, Thomas. I'm glad to be this record holder. I didn't know I was till today.
Well, the Vision of the Soul series we did ended up being more episodes than I can't remember if we did it in 1 or 2 sessions, but it ended up being 3 episodes. So that's why. Even without that, you would probably hold the record, even if that had been one last episode or yeah. But
well, if somebody starts to approach me, let me know and I'll write another book and we can do another interview just to keep me out in front.
Great. Okay, so I know you had mentioned somewhere that you didn't expect to have another volume of poems out so soon after your previous one. Now, this book includes your series Quarantine Notebook, which was originally written for Dappled Things and posted online in the first few months of quarantine last year. And is that like essentially the reason that you had a book out so soon? Is that because you were putting out all of those quarantine poems and they sort of took up enough space that you could?
That was a big part of it. I subscribe to what I just call the Anthony Hecht philosophy, because Anthony Hecht, who was one of the great 20th century American poets, when you look at his collected poems, it's easy to see that roughly he was putting out a book every half a decade to a decade. And when it comes to new poetry, that's about the right pace to do it, because it takes a long time for a work of art to start to get absorbed into the culture and to be read and distributed. So people are still discovering my first book from 2014, Some Permanent Things, and so there, in that regard, I think it's bad for poets to publish too much. I certainly urge caution on people who come to me seeking that advice in a way that I haven't quite followed through here. But in a sense, I had no choice for the reason you suggest. I had written this long Quarantine Notebook poem, which seemed to a lot of people who were reading it as it was being written and published serially in Dappled Things, and seemed to me to be doing something that would give a sort of permanent vision of the quarantine age through which we're going. And a lot of people don't want a permanent vision of that, but I think the experience had to be interpreted, and I thought this poem would be helpful to people to help them interpret or understand their own experience and our collective experience together. So I wanted it to be out on the sooner side.
Right.
Just one other incidental thing is just I've just found in the last few years that just verse comes much more quickly than it used to. I just tend to think in verse more than I used to, and so I just want to be writing more. And so I don't have quite the choice that I wanted to, or that I thought was most prudent anyhow, about holding some of the poems back, because there's going to be just too much of a glut if I don't publish a little more frequently than I intended to.
Well, that's pretty cool. I mean, I suppose what you hope for as an artist, right? To have that kind of like, native tongue, so to speak.
Yeah. Oh, the dismay of those years where I'd be lucky to get write 2 poems and a translation in a year. I'm glad those days are over.
So I know it's a bit long, but would you mind reading one of these quarantine poems? I'm thinking specifically of my personal favorite, which is the April 8th poem. Would you be willing to read that in full, or is that too much?
Yeah, the April 8th? No, I can do that. That's interesting that that's a favorite of yours. In a way, it's a favorite of mine, um, uh, too, but for the most eccentric reason possible, which is um, I was reading either Therese or Milosh, both of whom are mentioned here. I don't remember which,
Right.
and and I suddenly had the idea for this poem, and I jotted it down on the bookmark, and then that bookmark has somehow sort of circulated through different books over the last several months. So every month or so, I open a book and I see this bookmark that has the first all but illegible sketch uh, of this poem, it's there's such a pleasure in the mystery of going from zero to one, from nothing to something, and that bookmark reminds me of that kind of feeling of blessing, when you get to make some new thing
Nice.
every time I see it. I'm grateful for you asking me to read this one for another reason, and that it's a poem in part about the absence of baseball, and I just realized in 4 days the first spring training games are going to be played this year, so I'll be glad to have baseball back in my life after
Nice.
its several months absence for the off season, but also after the terrible truncation of the season that occurred last year. So April 8th, 2020. The vodka bottle, blue as buried sapphire, has lain near empty on its side, a year or more, forgotten at the freezer's back, beneath the bags of strawberries, fries, and nuggets, and thickening with a glaze of permafrost. The state stores being closed, and suddenly without means of buying more, I dig it out. This is no era for martinis, all briny and medicinal, but sweetness, compensatory, generous, and concealing. And so I watch it flow like syrup down into the crevices of ice, then top the highball off with juice. This hour of night in normal times, I'd take my drink and sit, a book in hand, to catch the baseball game. I'd alternate between the back and forth of lines of verse that volley down the page and glances up to see the Cubbies' struggles. There on the screen, encircled by the crowd, who turn their backs upon the world and yet provide a noisy solitude, the pitcher shakes off a signal, nods, winds up, and throws. At such remove does art find concentration. The thing made stiffens toward integrity. 9 doubtful innings fumble to a hole, and thus take on a kind of permanence. The season, like the liquor stores, suspended, I feel myself fall back on younger ways. I'd sit up reading till the early morning, a sleepless, lonesome undergraduate, and switch as hours passed and I grew weary from book to book, with each one lighter, easier in sequence, till my eyes at last dropped shut. As I did then, I find myself once more alone, a crop of titles at my side. I open up Milosh. It's like a phone book and not more interesting at first, it seems. The listing hazy images of dreams mistaken by their source for prophecy. But when the Nazi tanks roll into Warsaw, the spine at once grows straight. The ruined street and what lies buried in its sudden wreckage become too serious and lost for playing. A pile of books stacked in a roofless building, the lambent face of Giordano Bruno surrounded by the busy market stalls, the chatter as the tourists spoon gelato, the poet staring on his father reading on broken statues, churches, emptied ghettos. His voice cries out in heavy lamentation to see the art that he had meant for freedom. A flight of butterflies, a taste of vodka burning then disappearing on the tongue, must come to something far more serious. His natural love would have preferred affairs with all the European capitals, to savor brilliance without consequence, and traipse from place to place and settle nowhere. But now he's rudely forced to take dictation, to make a record of what's been destroyed, preserving too in ink the names of those who laughed, so pleased to be the ones destroying. He's had to root his love and hatred down in one foundation, lest it be forgotten, resigned himself to play the mournful witness who digs in deeper as he heads to exile. The minutes creeping on toward somnolence, I pull out my collected Betjeman. His boisterous, thumping ballads make me think of Kipling or what Eliot said of him. It may not come to poetry, but verse contains its own perfections, and, he adds, perhaps a little envious, it's verse that people memorize and sing and say. They'll clap to lines of Exeter and Croydon, while sighing above their pints, and with a curse summon the friendly bombs to fall on Slough, to which there's no replying but with cheers. It's such an easy accidental contrast, the serious poet, witness, visionary, as formless as a ghost weighed with lead, in confrontation first with Nazi troops and later with a whole regime of lies, as Russians came to be a second master. And Betjeman, who failed at math, but could stomp out a rhythm with his drunken hoof to set the patrons rocking on their stools and let them know their island's not so bad. But I'm not done. I find upon my stack the story of a soul, and there she is, Therese, that round face floating in her habit, who tells us not all flowers can be roses, that we must take such grace as we are given. I'm not the first to see her infant freedom, that liveliness which tumbles into trouble and teeters high upon a kitchen chair, that flighty glee to play at kings and queens, will carry her just where she's meant to go. All freedom seeks its fullness in a cloister. All laughter merges with the prayers of Carmel. In solitude we find our company and speak most frankly in a form commanded. So much we can discern within that portrait of her dressed up to play St. Joan of Arc, that wild mane parted, draped behind her armor. One hand upholds the flag of fleur-de-lis, the other lightly rests upon a sword. How freely she would give herself away, to burn within the fire of Christ's love. O Lady of Lisieux, I think you found the form where depths reveal their splendid glory. You are the living image of perfection. But then, the mind adrift, the hour late, I think as well how perfect form appears within the pitcher working from the stretch. His spine upright, his rear foot on the rubber, his eyes indifferent to the facing batter and conscious of the runner just behind him. He holds his glove raised up to hide his face, and in the leather darkness of its womb, mysterious and patient, he will form an arc of flight to catch the outside corner, chosen for just this moment and that man, but also in response to what has come before and what will follow down the count. Each pitch contains, within its narrow compass, the splendid, sprawling thoughts of past and future, and yet remains a thing of concentration, whose name proclaims itself in what it does.
Awesome. Thank you for taking the time to read that. I know it's one of the longer pieces, even in the even among those quarantine poems.
Mm-hmm.
The one reason I liked it right off the bat was just its reflection of kind of somebody with no discernible schedule left to him by the events of the world, and just kind of staying up and reading one book after another. Although in my case, it was unfortunately more like watching the entire Matrix trilogy or whatever. But just that kind of like late night kind of wandering, something, as a night owl, trying to get better at that. But something I can certainly relate to. And then the way that the poem kind of finds the balance between, I don't know, like pure play and like depth and solemnity in Saint Therese, um, and I guess kind of then takes it back and brings that back to the experience of a game of baseball is really interesting. There's something in Sanctity that manages to sort of like transcend those human types.
It's so strange with Milosz. You could to read his first poems and then to read some of his more mature poems reflecting on the kind of career he thought he was going to have. That I describe it pretty accurately in the poem. He really had this vision of being a sort of aesthete whose poetry would work like a taste of vodka. It would just burn and then leave nothing behind it. And that was not where his talent lay at all. And 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 it's so hard to really get your mind around this, to contemplate this. He had a talent that was perfectly attuned to bear witness to the great crimes against humanity in the 20th century, first by the Nazis and then by the Soviets, and to stand athwart that, to record it, and to insist upon man's spiritual destiny despite these materialist philosophies that were trampling everything underfoot. So what you see in his work is someone whose talent was perfectly calibrated for a task that, had he just been born at another time, would have been an irrelevant task or not the task assigned him, and he would have done something else altogether. And this poem as a whole is, and indeed the Quarantine Notebooks as a whole, are kind of explorations over how all these things that seem so highly contingent and improbable, that not that it's that bizarre that I would just happen to have Milosz and John Betjeman and Therese stacked on my on my side table, and that I just happen to be reading at the same time, and they just happen to form a perfect philosophical dialectic about the nature of art. That's not the most improbable of things. But there are so many incredibly improbable things that look like pure happenstance, pure circumstance. And then we look at them closely and we find that in God's providence, they are rhyming together. They are forming resonant sounds that build upon each other and build up to some large, magnificent structure. Milosz is just one example in the poem, but a great example of how curious history works that way.
So do you think that part of the reason, I mean, Saint Therese has kind of all those elements to her is because of her, not only because of her holiness per se, but because of her kind of like transcendence of the time that she lived in and the circumstances that shaped her personality?
Well, I mean, she's another example of you couldn't have predicted that she would be the one who would be perfectly calibrated to communicate something very profound and essential to human beings. But so she was. I mean, she was on the one hand, she was a very sentimental child in an age where Catholicism, especially in France, was really communicating itself by way of the sentiments, just as or in converse with, say, 50 years later in the early 20th century, where Catholicism was primarily communicating itself through as Fulton Sheen would have put it, it's clinging to the justness and the necessity of reason, including in human reason, philosophical reason, and theological reason. In Therese's days, she was communicating the spirit of Catholicism through her sort of girlish sentimentality, whereas again, 2 decades later, it would be the hardness of the intellect, in an age that had become misological, as Plato would put it, had come to suspect reason. That would be, at that moment, the Catholic Church's providential role to modern human beings. So there's that curious thing that she happened to be the right kind of sentimentalist at the right moment. But then the way in which she transcends everything, the way in which her total interior devotion to Christ by the little way continues to lead people not only to new vocations but just to change their lives, is really something. And was she 24 when she died? I mean, she had such a brief life, and as she
Right.
promised would be the case, posthumously she has continued to live on by making saints.
You made a remark to me recently, and I'm gonna mention it detached from the context in which in which the remark was made. You said something about the narrowing of Catholic intellectual life, and you said specifically in the last decade. Well, you said here. I'll just read what you said, if you don't mind. You said,
Mm-hmm. Sure.
in the last decade, it seems to me traditional Catholicism has gone from being the place of the greatest intellectual vitality to a Philistinism that is the mirror image of the contemporary left. This climb, let's see. That context is not a sign of a restored doctrinal seriousness among Catholics. It is rather the extension of secular leftist illiberal censoriousness into the church, which is the smoke of Satan as much as the spread of modernism and unbelief within the church has been. Now, I assume when you say illiberal, we did a whole podcast criticizing liberalism, even in its sort of like original variety. So I assume I shouldn't read too much into your use of that particular word, but I'm kind of interested in knowing what you're talking about more generally in Catholic intellectual life.
Yeah. Well, so without naming names,
Sure,
I
absolutely, yeah.
I'm increasingly concerned about what I'm seeing among uh, more traditional, to use that phrase for a second, traditional Catholics. I don't like that phrase traditional, and I loathe the phrase trad. I think uh,
Mm-hmm.
it's frightening how people who would stand athwart the image of the age are reproducing themselves in the kind of handy little tags that our consumer culture um, bequeaths to us. We want to stand outside of
Hmm.
those things rather than simply have our own little brand of them, uh, our own little consumer choice of a particular kind of dogma. Um, so, so forgive the language there, but I I think the difference in the last 10 years, and it's hard to really take the measure of how significant this particular kind of division is. Um, but from what I can tell from afar, and I am in my own way kind of afar because we're all so relatively isolated these days for not just through quarantine but through social media, etc. But um, 10 years ago, it seemed that that the two most robust divisions within the church, or the great robust division in the church, was between a graying um, spirit of Vatican II liberalism and an intellectually serious, doctrinally serious. Um, I'm going to use the phrase conservative Catholicism, but that's inadequate to it. Just a more authentic Catholicism um, that took seriously both the great achievements of the intellectual and spiritual achievements of the church in the 19th and early 20th century, and took also very seriously the great benefits of the ressourcement that that great theological generation, including de Lubac and von Balthasar and Pope Emeritus Benedict, were all included in that. Those were the two chief divisions, and within that latter camp, certainly I knew many people who were uh, in the St. Pius X Society and had certain further eccentricities beyond that, but there was a general consensus of what a doctrinally serious and authentic and in communion with the church Catholicism looked like. And there was a sense that there were a clear sense that there was still live among us a very lamentable departure from that orthodoxy. What I see now is a further division or branching off, where people who are authentically drawn to the Catholica, who want to be transformed by Christ and by his church and be integrated into his mystical body fully through the sacraments, that in the pursuit of doing that, they're looking for shortcuts. And those shortcuts are often expressed by simply pretending that they can construct their own orthodoxy out of a handful of cherry-picked church documents. And then what I think is worse than that is they can misread those documents, especially, say, the documents condemning modernism, and then the whole world begins to look like a series of modernist heretics. And the story continues. There are people who I suppose you might call demagogues. You might also call them pseudo-intellectuals, who claim to be really good at interpreting and discerning the difference between an authentic and an orthodox theology and the modernism that has invaded the church, which they're right. It has invaded the church. It's in the church. We know that. That's not in question. But they're just taking a butcher's cleaver and trying to lop everything away in hopes that they will be saved. And I mean, the number of criticisms one could level at this are probably more than I can count on my fingers. I mean, the part of it is one thing I want to begin with very briefly is I noticed years ago amongst people who are really like me, a propensity to substitute talking about church politics for actually talking about the spirituality and the doctrines of the church. And that is a kind of shortcut spirituality. You just keep hoping, I hope John Paul II is going to finally appoint that conservative bishop. And here I hear this rumor. That kind of chatter actually substitutes for an authentic engagement with the faith. And now it seems to be pullulating through conspiracy theories, which of course I'm with everybody who says conspiracy theories aren't bad if they're true, but through very weak and unsubstantiated conspiracy theories that are serving a very convenient point. What is that point? To create a simulacrum of thought where there in fact is none.
So this seems to go to a certain extent with your recent essay on Maritain for Church Life Journal, right? I mean, that's the sort of thing that you're addressing, but more by focusing on Maritain than on his critics. Of course, you're doing something very positive in that piece.
Yeah, indeed. The attack on Maritain that I was responding to was more or less regurgitated from the 1930s, and I think the scholarly consensus was that there was not really a there. There was an unwillingness on the part of the great philosopher Deconic to hear what Maritain was writing, and then first of all there were people who wanted to defend Maritain who wanted to hear him saying things he wasn't saying. And then there was Maritain himself, I think, was charitable in refusing to engage Deconic directly in this debate on personalism and the common good. But he wrote, actually, of course, one of his great books, the very short one, The Person and the Common Good, as a tacit response to Deconic. And there's nothing that Maritain says there that isn't also found in Deconic's defense of church teaching. That was kind of a pseudo controversy. What I think was occurring there is I think we all sense that something has gone deeply wrong, both with our society, with our broader civilization and our culture, and within the church. And there's no question that it has. And in fact, so much has gone wrong that it's very lucrative, at least emotionally lucrative, to just go in search of villains. And that's becoming a substitute for actually simply recovering the doctrines of the church, and recovering an authentic practice.
More generally speaking, I mean, I'm sure a lot of this is tied into like the Pope Francis era, and to some extent the Donald Trump era, of course, and just the situation in the United States. But I certainly have noticed, people talk about the Francis effect. For me, in my world, the Francis effect has mostly been causing people to call into question a lot of, in a similar way to that Trump did, I suppose, that a lot of the sort of conservative status quo in thinking, and I found that in some ways to be a positive thing. I mean, I prefer to move beyond, say, and I don't say this to bash anybody, but like the kind of like the George Weigel consensus, for instance, on various things, and kind of like an unrealistic optimism about the culture, for instance. But yeah, there is a certain reactionary tendencies, a certain vulgar traditionalism that's really based on social media and podcasts and all this stuff. But at the same time, I grew up in a pretty kind of like what you might call like John Paul II Catholicism, and there were church teachings I wasn't really that aware of, even though we were sort of self-consciously orthodox. So I've had to learn some things myself about the traditional teachings on church and state. I've had to go deeper into some of the social teachings myself, the traditional teachings on, the hierarchy, the structure of the family, which I think were not really contradicted in my education or anything. I wouldn't say any of this was really contradicted, but it was just something that I was unaware of on a deeper level. So, last year I read, for me, I don't think it's so much the Francis effect as just kind of my own personal journey with this stuff. But last year I read all the foundational social encyclicals and, also a couple of the encyclicals about church and state, and just found them really giving me a different perspective from what the sort of conservative Orthodox Catholicism that I was accustomed to. And, if I tell someone in that world that, actually the church, multiple popes have taught that, absolute freedom of publication and, freedom to publish your opinions, is not really a benefit to society, for instance, they will be shocked by that. And it seems like I'm, almost making it up until I show them the text, But of course, you're right that there are people who will take that and then kind of take it to be in a self-indulgent way, kind of take it to an extreme. Like I'm now forming an identity on being so opposed to everything modern or so reactionary that virtually any bad opinion has to be denounced as like some kind of heresy or Freemasonry or something.
Just tarring everything with the word modernism, it simply won't do. And it's a gesture that makes pretenses of a rigorous and faithful orthodoxy, that's often rooted in a kind of ignorance, and including an ignorance of what modernism was. I mean, modernism was a very specific heresy within the history of the church. It's not just sort of the general brush with which you can tar every departure from orthodoxy. There's just we so much was lost. So much has been lost that we as Catholics will be struggling to recover for generations, if we ever do recover it. It's not surprising to me that the novel A Canticle for Leibowitz seems to become more popular as a great Catholic novel as the years go on. because so many of us are living like barbarians trying to hold together or piece together the fragments of a tradition that we know was once whole, and that we just can't. We don't have the architectonic view to put it all together adequately again. And that's the consequence of so many decisions at so many different places and times, that it's daunting to try to overcome it, or to overcome that obstacle. And so people are finding really quick children's scissors and paste way to do that, to overcome it. And they're not actually solving the problem. They're merely creating new, stranger fragments. But the church tradition is whole, despite our massive forgetting, and we just need to recover with patience that whole history, and also read it in light of the history. I mean, just very briefly, I've always been very moved by the early social encyclicals. The idea of a third way, the introduction of the principles of subsidiarity and solidarity, the understanding that liberalism and communism are both misguided, though one perhaps worse than the other. Economic liberalism, I mean by that, classical liberalism. Those are all great and insightful things. But I think we need to recognize, in a document like Gaudium in Space, and then with John Paul II in the 90s with Centesimus Annus, that the church was not just playing ideology the way so many contemporary political thinkers do when it wrote those social encyclicals. It was responding to real and specific threats to both the church and to peoples everywhere by industrialization and by the rise of trade union socialism and communism. And in the wake of the Second World War, the church's qualified endorsement of free market and the basic principles of economic liberalism that said the best way to lift people out of poverty is the generation of greater wealth. That was the church being limber and responsive to what was actually happening in history. So we can't simply, so though we need to continue to read and admire the early social encyclicals, we can't merely lift them out of their context. And when we look at the church's qualified endorsements of economic liberalism, we cannot simply lift those out of their context either and pretend that somehow the church has put paid to all imaginative social doctrine and we've got it all solved. We're just gonna have the rising tide lift all boats. That's neither of those things is true. The church is a living organization that has to, amongst many other things, determine what is just for human beings at each given stage of history.
I find it difficult personally to see with the eyes of people, in the 1960s, the people, the good people working at Vatican II. I think that it's very difficult for people now who have really taken stock of the dire situation in which we find ourselves to kind of see why somebody would have thought changes were necessary at the time, because we can't live in. It's harder to see some of the problems that they were responding to at the time in Catholic culture. And it's easy to say, well, what we have now, is not, the dominant culture is not a rigid moralistic one, for example. It's hard to see why there would have been changes needed in the liturgy. And perhaps a lot of them weren't needed. I'm not even saying that they were, but
right.
Trying to keep an open mind and recognizing what I might not be seeing about the perspective of the popes at the time. I think something that has also shaken me a bit is realizing to what extent, like, even my kind of like perhaps a little bit self-satisfied conservative Catholicism that I was raised in, like we have the fullness of the faith here, and we don't leave anything out, did in fact leave certain things are out. Not again, not in contradiction, but in maybe we would be a little bit embarrassed about certain things that St. Paul said. Just to look at the preaching that I encounter on a regular basis from good Orthodox priests, and yet so much of it almost seems like a different religion from when I read a sermon by Newman or by one of the fathers. There's a clear continuity between Newman and the fathers and any medieval saint or anything, and the sobriety with which they preach, and the reality with which they preach about, positive and negative things about salvation, about the honor which God is owed, fear of the Lord, the reality of sin, and justice, and just the attitude of sobriety and self-mortification, and what I so often get even from good Orthodox priest is kind of a psychological humanism, and maybe perhaps still a reluctance to talk about sin. Not that we should be obsessed with it, obviously. And then with, the fact that very few people, even in sort of conservative Catholic land, really have a robust sense of the reality of hell. And I don't know if that's entirely blamable on von Balthasar, but that seems to have been, without condemning his work as a whole, that does seem to have been his kind of his most notable contribution to like sort of the mainstream of Catholicism, as opposed to maybe his good contributions that intellectuals or specialists might be aware of. That seems to have been his most like sort of wide ranging impact. And so I do understand why people would be suspicious of some of these figures or inclined to treat them as enemies. I guess the big problem for me is when they treat someone like Maritain as an enemy rather than somebody who maybe was unduly optimistic in some respect or got some things wrong. I think you do have to be able to distinguish between a James Martin and a Jacques Maritain, so to speak.
Yeah, I think. I would say von Balthasar's book on hell was not a major contribution at any point. Until the early 2000s, it was relatively unknown. But is it Catherine Pickstick's dissertation criticizing it, and I think probably criticizing it justly, brought it to greater prominence, and brought about a kind of confrontation where a lot of people who had a very loving understanding of von Balthasar's project suddenly realized that there are some problems within the theology that need at least to be contemplated, if not outright set aside or condemned. But I mean, von Balthasar's his central concern in all of his theology is to view the faith as a whole, to insist that 19th century disintegrative modes of interpretation, such as the higher criticism that sought to parse fact from fiction within the scriptures, you can't actually do that. By which I mean, a book of scripture, Genesis, is a whole. Let's say for a moment that it is pieced together from various manuscripts. When the new manuscript takes its place and assumes its place among the canon as a whole, it's now a whole that has to be understood as a unit. We can't just break off little bits like Thomas Jefferson or like any fellow at will and choose this or that aspect of the work of the book of scripture as authentic. Von Balthasar's main contribution was to insist, to use his phrase, that beauty is the primordial phenomenon, by which he means that the total form of things gives itself to us. And our task is to enter into the mystery of that form and to explore its parts, but never with the presumption that we somehow can simply dissect the form and discard part and keep the other part. And so, one of the things that has upset me is hearing people reject the the John Paul II Catechism,
Hmm.
where that catechism, as it's architecturally conceived, is on von Balthasar's model, and it proposes that there is an organic unfolding of the faith given to us by Christ, and that faith must be received whole. And in order to receive
Yeah.
it whole, you can't just say, well, I've got all the contents. I've got this, that, and the other. No. You have to see the form whole. You have to see the full revelation radiating out from the heart of the church. Um, just as
Wow.
just as you would not say you knew me really well because somebody gave you a binder with a bunch of facts about my life. You would need to
Right.
see me as a full person, living, breathing, talking before you. And only then could you
Yeah.
say, now I know what James is going to say in response to this question.
Right.
That all the facts in the binder in the world wouldn't do it. And and uh, and I mean that's, I think, von Balthasar's central contribution to our theology. Um, his disquisitions on hell, though they've been very important for a number of people I respect, I see them as a very minor contribution, and
Hmm.
exploring one thing that he's just trying to understand, and that is, what does it mean for Christ to descend into hell? What is the
Right.
extent of Christ as man's sacrifice, Christ as
Hmm.
Son of God's sacrifice when he goes down into hell? And his explorations there, as far as I know, are very tentative um, because this is a mystery that we're not really fully privileged to fathom. It's a mystery of the faith that we have to accept first, and then we can fruitfully think about it in a sort of tentative and speculative way.
Right. Well, I mean, perhaps my impression there of his overall impact is it's shaped by this culture of controversy that we live in. I mean, for example, I discovered Maritain through his work on the arts, and that's primarily
Hmm.
how I know him. So
Right.
I've gotten emails from people when I did my Maritain episode with Samuel Hazo. I got an email from someone who had watched the EWTN documentary on Saul Alinsky, and all they knew about Maritain was that he was a
Yeah.
friend and admirer of Alinsky, which it admittedly is somewhat disturbing, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
you want to
Agreed.
kind of
Yeah.
like try to figure that out,
Yeah.
but it's a sad thing that was all they knew about him, and got the impression that he was basically an enemy of the church, and somehow the reason that there were too many gay men in the priesthood or something. I forget what what the person said, but it was something about that. So
Yeah.
that is a bit concerning. It really overlooks. It also just overlooks the person you're dealing with.
Hmm.
It's not only a problem intellectually, but it is unjust to Maritain, the person.
I mean, nobody can know everything. Nobody can read everything. I came to Maritain through the arts, but his work on aesthetics primarily. Myself, and we're not under an obligation to read all the books of a given author. That would be impossible, especially in the case of people like Maritain and von Balthasar, who were publishing oftentimes more than a book a year for half a century. Um, that's not the burden we need to place on ourselves. The burden we need to place on ourselves is to recognize that the alternative to the many heterodox and culture and cult destroying activities of so many Catholics within the church and so many people outside the church in the last 100 years is not simply to create a choose your own adventure, self constructed
Right.
vision of
Right.
orthodoxy. And
Yeah. Well, what you need is Jesus Christ. I mean, is what essentially what you were saying about the
Mhm,
Catechism, I think,
mhm,
because you have to have a vision of the church that is not the sum total of teachings and documents.
right. It's those things, but those things are held within a whole that transcends them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's switch gears entirely
Yeah.
and go back to a poem here.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. Why don't we do uh, Inhabitants?
Oh gosh, I'm glad to read that one. I have to give you the epigraph, the first epigraph to the book as a whole. It's from Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. He writes, but these, he goes to Tierra del Fuego, right? But these Fuegians in the canoe were quite naked, and even one full-grown woman was absolutely so. These poor wretches were stunted in their growth, their hideous faces bedaubed with white paint, their skins filthy and greasy, their hair entangled, their voices discordant, and their gestures violent. Viewing such men, one can hardly make oneself believe that they are fellow creatures and inhabitants of the same world. So this is the poem Inhabitants. I know. You've spent this whole day wandering through clumps of trees and seen the sunlight shine until that gushy heart is all a swing at God's deaf needlework, so soft and fine. Yea, like some vicar mounting to his nest, you sigh and stutter sweet and gentle words, that all is love, but we are loved the best, a bit more even than those charming birds. But man's hands spoil everything they touch, and someone following after you will spoil the scene with shifty eyes and thieving clutch, and make you weep we're sprung from common soil. Then you will preach a different sort of text, just like the naturalist who turned explorer. Each painted face he saw left him perplexed, and made him feel our brotherhood with horror.
This reminds me of a line in another of your quarantine notebook poems where you talk about empathy, you know, the religion of empathy and how it often flies away quite quickly under the right circumstances. You're commenting on a lot of like very modern tendencies here, and certainly the tendency to kind of like idealize and romanticize nature would be one of those, and then to kind of to have a disgust reaction to one's fellow man.
Many years ago, I was in the Church of Ireland chapel, attached the churchyard attached to which is where W.B. Yeats is buried, and I went in for some kind of Vesper service. I don't quite remember how I got there or what occasioned it. But the Anglican or Church of Ireland priest mounted his pulpit, and he said, "Did you notice that everything that God has made in nature is good? It's only what man makes that is bad, or that's ugly or despoiled." And I remember the woman next to me just leaned over and said, "That's not true." That's a very romantic and sentimental doctrine, and it seems fitting that I should have heard it in a romantic and sentimental church from a romantic and sentimental priest. The sentimentality, our feelings, are of course such powerful things, but we rely on them too much out of hope that they'll be very powerful for us, right? We want to generate emotions for ourselves. I love Walker Percy, or Binks Bowling and Walker Percy's The Moviegoer, where he says he doesn't trust music because he knows that music always has designs on him to get him to feel something. And you think back to the 19th century, that supposedly greatly disillusioned fellow Nietzsche, who clearly was using Wagner's music to gin up some emotion in his otherwise rather flaccid soul. Sentimentality is precisely because our feelings can be so powerful. They're also really prone to a kind of abuse, and a gross abuse. If you want to affirm things as good and as worthy of love, you've got to be willing to see things in their being, not just in how they make you feel. You have to go, as it were, from Kant, who only talks about the presentation of the object, to Maritain or to Aquinas, to Plato, to Aristotle, to see the substance, to see the form, to see the being of things in their existence. And so this poem is my critical move within the book about this propensity to a sentimental account of being as opposed to a properly ontological one. But of course, it's answering and questioning other poems in the book that take the deliverances of being more hopefully.
You're making me think of an Oscar Wilde quote. He says, "Music makes one feel so romantic. At least it always gets on one's nerves," which is the same thing nowadays.
Yeah. And Wilde in Picture of Dorian Gray is actually really good at seeing through the pretenses of aestheticism. All of his characters give way and refuse to see things for what they are. They all end up saying, "Well, I love beautiful things, but I really just like them for the feeling they induce in me." Whereas if an aesthete were really an aesthete, he would see the thing, he would see the form, and he would see the beauty in the form, not just the feeling it gives to him. I think that this is why actually the Thomist revival, I think, was such a marvelous thing for the church and for all of civilizations, of our civilization's history, is learning to appreciate being as being is absolutely essential to the dignity of the human person. We talked about this in the Vision of the Soul interview, that our status as intellectual animals, as rational animals, is the capacity to receive form, to receive the intelligible reality of substances, and to enter into communion thereby with them. But we poor lazy humans don't like the intellectual rigor that goes along with seeing things for what they are and in the depths of their mystery. And so we often gin up a cheap substitute called sentimentality. But it's flabby.
Yeah. Well, for me, this is the fundamental value of art as well. At least speaking as a musician, the ability to appreciate something for what it is. But I recognize that wouldn't have been sort of an obvious. I'm certain that's it has everything to do with my reading of philosophers like Maritain and Gilson, because it wouldn't be obvious to someone certainly probably in the 19th century context. That it wasn't something more to do with the sentiments or something like that. I think Wilde had a definition of sentimentality too, something to do with feeling emotions one hasn't earned, or something like that.
Yeah. If he didn't say there's another poem.
Yeah. Right. There's another poem that kind of is on the flip side of this, I think, an after dinner speech. Maybe you could read that one.
Yes, thank you. Yes, this is one of my wife's favorite poems, because she grew up in a. Here we've spent a lot of our time together talking about the devastation wrought by the 60s, the throwing aside, if I may refer back to von Balthasar, the throwing aside of all forms, the dissolution of all forms in an iconoclastic age that thinks that every form is an imposition on our freedom. And my wife grew up in you might say, in an environment that was a thoroughgoing victim of this, and all her life she was crying out for the dignity of forms to be restored, the dignity of manners to be restored. And so she was really grateful when I wrote this poem, as it were, very explicitly taking her side. An after dinner speech, you have to envision, just hearing a poem the first time, it can be a little hard to take in full. I think so for readers hearing this the first time, envision a portly man in a suit with his brandy snifter and cigar, rising to give a postprandial toast, that is, to give an after-dinner speech. An after-dinner speech. Even now we subject to mockery the old, officious, and avuncular postprandial toast. For can we not all see its mannered strains at dignity laid bare, its emptiness encrusted in jeweled pomp? Such are the rites on which barbarians stomp. He rises from the far head of the table, a snifter cradled near his vested paunch, cigar ash lengthening as he tells some fable from whose sententious finish he will launch on memories of an age consigned to dust, and in whose morals we no longer trust. But he will carry on undaunted, he, two nephews choking napkins in their lap, a sister glaring in her cup of tea, and wondering where he's boiled up such pap, of which it seems he has unending store, even as his deafened aunt begins to snore. we mock these things, though they've long passed away, and left no decent mores in their place, and mock, though we have nothing else to say, no fine ingathering right or formal grace, but just an artery's throb to stand unnumbered with a raging mob.
Right. So we hear this line now, that kind of civility is almost like a ploy to prevent real change, right? To prevent real change, to forestall the revolution that's needed. That's a very common attitude nowadays. And everything is continually breaking down the refinement of communication. I mean, it's really the norm now to use obscenity in a sort of periodical context, in an op-ed context, even in certain publications. So that, on the other hand, though, we all know the kind of the guy who goes to a young man who goes to a conservative university or college and comes out and he's always wearing bow ties and quoting Eliot and Burke at you, and it's all sort of fake and phony. Yeah. How do you the problem with restoring these kind of refinements, and I think admittedly in the poem you get the impression this guy genuinely is kind of a blowhard, and yet there's something to what he's doing. The problem with trying to restore these refinements, and not just refinements, but sort of like aspects of higher culture, is how do you do it without it being an affectation? How do you do it without it being kind of a fakery, kind of like a man trying to be a man living outside of his time? Yes.
How do you become cultured if you're not actually a participant in a culture?
Right.
That's
a great way of putting it.
This is a problem that besets us from so many places. People who use phrases like cultural appropriation are so far from knowing what they're talking about that you don't really want to give them even enough of a hearing to try to understand what they're saying. But listen to the deep misunderstanding of that phrase, cultural appropriation, as if a culture were so much property that you own. First of all, I always find that funny because all these postmodern, whatever you call them, woke, communistic, intersectional, gosh, we could list off all these silly words that describe these people. When it comes down to brass tacks, evidently, they just really strongly agree with John Locke's second treatise on the nature of property. They're just classical liberals. They think of culture as property. Culture is not property. Culture, you can't have your own culture, as in I'm a culture of one. Culture is the whole way of life of a people. And those ways of lives, of course, are continually bumping and jostling up against each other, just as you bump and jostle against your neighbor on the train. And so there's no my culture versus your culture that I can lay claim to. The moment I have contact with something a foreign person has done, that suddenly has become potentially part of my culture. So he can't say, no, you can't have it, or you don't have my permission to use it. That's all, absurd and silly. On the flip side, those of us who realize that we live in barbarous times rightly yearn for some kind of structure and order and form to be given back to us. And we have reason to yearn for that because we deserve it. Human beings are made to be in part of a culture. And so when you have a culture that's become a kind of anti-culture, which is what Philip Reif refers to ours as being, it's a culture that says there is nothing transcendent that's worthy of expression. And every culture is, in fact, the temporal or profane, as it were, expression of a prior and a priori perception of a sacred order. We live in a day where the idea of a sacred order is thought to be preposterous. And so every form, every social form, every bit of civility is going to feel either a little bit ironic and kitschy, or maybe just pure inauthentic, as in we're putting on roles, we're mugging about truths, with the forms of truths in which we no longer believe. But we all know that there's an order to which we ought to belong. We all know that the world is ordered. It's irresistible. It's a product of the fact. We were talking about this just a moment ago about our intellectual natures. It's a product of the fact that we perceive order in everything in everything. Tout simple. You see a rock and you know it's a rock, and nobody's going to say, "Oh, it's not really a rock," or "It's rock is just a social construct." All of these kinds of things are absurd to say. We know that our minds have purchase on the world as existent, as being, and that one of the features or properties of being is truth. Once you acknowledge that by the very act of having the capacity to know, you're participating in an order that transcends you, you're in a position to begin building up a culture, building up a series of forms in which you can live and where you can find a place to be an inhabitant. But gosh, it's hard when we live in an anti-culture and every such effort is struck down as absurd and preposterous. And as you just said, it doesn't help that some of the people who take this activity most seriously put bow ties on. That just doesn't help.
Right. Yeah, I suppose the family is the most natural place to do it, rather than sort of striding into the market square with one's bow tie and declaiming at people. To build an environment where these things are natural, hopefully not in too much of a social experiment type of way. So we had a number of. Well, let me ask you this actually. You are noted as a great reciter of poetry, including your own. I've had the pleasure of hearing you recite things both over the internet, on my podcast, and in person on a number of occasions. And I think you strike a good balance between the kind of emotion and the drama of the poem and the sound of it. A lot of people tend to kind of veer towards one or the other. How do you suggest to reciters of poetry that they kind of strike the balance between the kind of sort of like theatrical aspect of it and the meaning of it, the sort of literal meaning of it, and the music of it?
There's so much to say on the subject, in part because nobody's ever discussed this matter fully and adequately.
Right.
There are a fair number of essays by good poets who are worth reading on the audible performance of poetry, but none of them really exhaust the subject or quite reach the pitch where we know we've got our answer on how the poem should be said. Ivor Winters is one of the great early examples, and he is merciless on actors. He loathes the way that they take Shakespeare's blank verse and just mash it up in keeping with their theatrical emotion.
Right.
And I think he's right to be critical of that, to the extent that the performance really has to be generated by the text, and the text should be your furthest limit on what you're willing to how far you're willing to go in the performance of it. You need to feel it's both what it's calling you to do, but also what it's calling you not to do, and what it's restraining or forbidding you from doing. And I think Winters is undoubtedly right that in the history of the theater, there have been plenty of actors who have been abusers of their scripts, and certainly of Shakespeare's verse. And it's not limited to merely mispronouncing words there, or ignoring the meter altogether. On the other hand, Winters went to an opposite extreme that I don't find adequate. It's actually quite adequate for his poems. He had a great voice for his own poems, but it wouldn't be something I would want to generalize. And he had a very sort of positivist tendency in his thinking. Winters really wanted the poet to recite in a restrained voice so that when the poem was translated from page to performance, a careful listener could perceive the meter every bit as perceptively as when you have the text before you, that you could perceive it. That's not really possible to do if you want to be faithful to a poem, among other reasons, because the enjambments, that is to say, the syntactical running over of a sentence across the board, the limit of a verse line, is so common in our poetry that what Winters is recommending will lead to a kind of distortion of performance. What I think we have to contemplate when we're thinking about the performance of poetry is the actual history of poetry. Poetry emerges from music, it emerges from song, and when it emerges from song, it emerges in a tetrameter line, in some kind of 4-beat line. And we still identify the 4-beat line, the tetrameter line, with musicality, as in most of our pop songs, not to mention our hymns and our sacred music and our classical music when it has choral performance, very frequently has the 4-beat line as its base. But when in the 16th century, to that 4-beat line, one extra metrical foot was added to create the iambic pentameter line. The reason that was done was so that poets would have a maximal flexibility in the kind of speech that they produced in their poetry. In an iambic pentameter line, you can tighten the rhymes, you can tighten the end stop of the lines, you can even break up the lines and use interior rhyme or have a hard regular caesura within the line so that you can replicate the shorter units that are proper to song. But then within the pentameter line, you can stretch it out. And if you're late Shakespeare, you stretch it out across lines and across line after line so that you get a single sentence taking 14 or 15 lines. And beginning in the middle of the line and end in the middle of the line, you can attain such a flexibility that any kind of rhetorical form, from song to the noble speech, like the after dinner speech or postprandial toast, to the plain statement, can all be represented, can all find expression within the verse line. And so the only thing to do is to attend to what the speech of the line is saying and to try to faithfully reproduce it in performance.
Cool. Thank you. Very interesting. Have to keep that in mind. Okay, here's a listener question. This is from Nathan Thompson in our Facebook group. Well, he had 3 questions, but I'm going to read the third one. Mm-hmm. What poets not usually praised in Catholic circles would you recommend reading? I hear plenty about Dante and Hopkins, for example, and non-Catholics such as Coleridge and Eliot. But who off this beaten trail would you most recommend?
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, I think I'll start with just recognizing why Hopkins is so often mentioned. It's because it's easy to discern the Catholicism within him. If you don't particularly like poetry, you might still like Hopkins because he passes on familiar religious sentiments. Hopkins is an amazing poet, so he's well worth studying. But I think the question indicates that Hopkins has come to occupy a central place, in part because he's just easier for us to absorb, even though there are so many challenges to be found in Hopkins' writing. The poets that so there are many poets I could potentially mention. I'm going to mention 2 off the cuff. The poets who we most need to be reading now, I think, are twofold. And they couldn't have been more different, even though they were part of the same movement that was in fact called the movement. And that is Philip Larkin and Elizabeth Jennings. Philip Larkin didn't believe in anything except for his vaguely self-consciously fascist inclinations towards authority, which in its own way was very charming. But his poems are absolutely essential reading because of their willingness to try to see things as they are and to see through things in an unsentimental way that nonetheless recognizes that sentiments come from somewhere. So, for instance, his poem "Church Going" is an absolute masterpiece of the unbeliever who's out on his bike in the English countryside, who stops for a moment at a country church just to kind of look around, and he feels like a trespasser. And he recognizes that he is in the presence of the sacred, and he really doesn't know what to do. One other example, I mean, I'm really going to be naming Larkin's two most famous poems here, but the Whitson Wedding, a man riding on a train to London who is really alone with himself and his thoughts and his book. And then he begins, as they go from station to station, he sees bride and groom, wedding party, time and again, saying farewell to their relatives and boarding the train as they go off to their honeymoon. And little by little, he gradually realizes, to go back to what we were talking about just a moment ago, that he actually is a participant in a culture. He's a participant in a culture with its forms and with its rights. And it was invisible to him before. And it's only, as it were, through the train window that he gets the kind of panoptic vision that allows him to see the world in which he was already a participant. I think so many Americans, they grow up thinking we don't have a culture, whereas of course the rest of the world thinks of us as a tyrannical monoculture. They may benefit from that kind of perspective. So Larkin, in many ways a very secular poet, is an essential poet for our age for a number of reasons, including that he's a humanistic poet. He was capable of speaking like a human being, which is something that virtually none of our contemporaries are capable of doing. And I'm not talking about the poets. I'm talking about the philosophers as well, and the intellectuals who speak the language of wokeness and intersectionality, but they don't speak a human language, a language that says people are people, in the words of the Muppets. What other poet? Part of Larkin's movement is Elizabeth Jennings, who wrote many more times more poems than Larkin, and in consequence has not been as absorbed by our culture or appreciated by our culture as I think in the long term she will be. There are some bad poems in her writing, but there are many good poems, more good poems overall than in Philip Larkin, who wrote fairly little poetry. And Jennings emerged out of the movement with Larkin, with Donald Davy, Tom Gunn, and other poets who are well worth reading in their own right. But Jennings was a very devout Catholic, and she took that humanistic speech of Larkin and managed to just super elevate it so that it entered further and deeper into the mystery that Larkin often touched upon, but rarely, fully perceived. And so between the two of them, you actually have a good lifetime's study.
Great. Here's a question from Nathan Douglas, and this could easily be a whole episode. And I'd like to maybe try to give it a brief answer, actually, if possible, like a summary answer. I will mention Nathan is a Catholic filmmaker in Vancouver, wonderful guy, and is kind of our guest co-host on Criteria. We just did a discussion of Andrei Rublev. So Nathan says, I would love to hear thoughts on applying the flowering of early to mid-century Catholic aesthetic thinking, Maritain, Gilson, Hildebrand, to today. Who is taking up their mantle today? What do you think remains to be developed from their thinking?
So the weakness, those figures had many strengths, and everybody knows I think that because, amongst other things, I wrote a book where Maritain is the central figure on the nature of beauty. What they were first concerned to do, and I'm really thinking of Maritain specifically here, although you can find this in Hildebrand and Gilson as well, is they were very gratified by the rise of aesthetic modernism as as a movement that recognized that the artist is a maker. Maritain associated photography with the scientific positivism of the Sorbonne and 19th century France. And so when he came to works of art, when he saw, as it were, a break in the work of art with a merely literalist representation, what he saw in that break, what he saw opening up there, was a doorway into the world of mystery and the secrets of being. And so he was very sympathetic to modernism precisely because it refused to participate in what he called the lie, the idea that the goal of the fine artist was merely to reproduce as exactly as possible the world as it appears to our mundane eye. Art needed to draw us beyond the surface of things into the deeper mystery of things. That was not an error, but the limitation here is that Maritain proved too willing to let verisimilitude or the surface beauties of things be cast by the wayside in the pursuit of a deeper kind of splendor. But we all know, and have known at least since Plato, that beauty in this world, the beauty of appearances, does bear an essential, not a merely contingent relationship to the intellectual beauties of the immortal beauties of truth. And so only those artists who are willing to recover the full aesthetic, to recognize the beauty of the voice, the beauty of melody, the beauty of form, the beauty of representation, including the beauty of saying, hey, that looks like my Aunt Bertha. Only the artists who are willing to recover that level, but to retain it and to unite it with the great insight that Maritain had about the power of art to open us to the deep mysteries of being. Only those artists, I think, really will bring back to a reestablished whole of what the arts ought to be doing. And this, I've gone on too long already, but let me just briefly say, this also involves a reunion of the high and the low, or the popular and the elite, a willingness to recognize that that good art should be speaking to multiple audiences in multiple ways, and that its power and its depth is first signaled to us in that capacity.
It's funny how this just goes right along with what we were saying about the church, and the teachings of the church. It's like just having the spirit along with the letter is essentially like we passed through an age which rejected the letter in favor of the spirit, and now there's the temptation to recover the letter without the spirit, and yes. we have to have both. If you don't mind, James, would you? I'm going to ask you to read two more poems in the course of as we finish up. But I want to get through a couple more questions too. Would you would it offend you if we read them without commenting on them very much?
No, I'm happy just to read poems.
So I would like to ask you to read. The last two poems we'll read will be somewhat ontological, I suppose. Through the Water.
Okay. This is the poem that when I wrote it, I knew that I was going to be publishing a new book. I knew I could feel a whole beginning to form from the poems I had been working on, and this was the one that distilled them. Boy, this is the theme today. This is a very von Balthasarian episode, seeing the form and seeing the whole. This is the poem that made a whole visible to me. Through the Water. I was talking about Winters earlier. It begins with an epigraph from Ivor Winters, which is just a note on his poem called The Castle of Thorns. And Winters writes, "He must in some way cross or dive under the water, which is the most ancient symbol of the barrier between two worlds. Far back within the mansion of our thought, we glimpse a lintel with a door that's shut, and through which all our lives would seem to lead, though we feel powerless to say toward what. It is the place where all the shapes we know give way to whispers and a gnawing gut. And so, in childhood, We will duck beneath the waterfall into a hidden cove. In summer, pass within a stand of pines cut off from those bright fields in which we rove, whose needles lay a softening bed of silence, and great boughs tightly weave a sacred grove. When winter settles in, and our skies darken, we take a trampled path by pond and wood, and find beneath an arch of slumbering thorn stray tufts of fur, a skull stripped of its hood. Then turn and look down through the thickening ice, in wonder at the strangeness of the good. And Peter, falling through that plain where he had only cast his nets before, and where behemoth stalked in darkest depths that sank and sank as if there were no floor, he cried out to the wind and felt a hand that clutched and bore his burden back to shore. We know that we must fall into such waters, must lose ourselves within their breathless power, until we are raised up, hair drenched, eyes stinging, by one who says to us that from this hour we have passed through, we're dead, but have returned, and are a new creation come to flower.
There's something I've been wanting to ask you about for a while, and it happens to coincide with another of our listener questions. By the way, thanks to all of those who submitted questions. I wasn't sure if I would get any responses or not, and I got a few, so that was nice. So this is from Ben on Twitter. He asks, is it challenging to be a conservative professor on a college campus in 2021? I'd like to fold that into my question, which is similar but more specific. When I heard you speak at the Catholic Artists Society in New York some time ago, I believe it was in the Q&A session that you mentioned your experiences teaching freshmen at Villanova. It was some kind of philosophy intro, or I forget exactly what it was, but your comments on kind of where those students are coming from and the challenges of teaching them and opening them up to what they think they already know or something like that were intriguing to me. So I guess there's two parts to this question. The first question is the second question is about that specifically, what I just mentioned. The first question is, what is it like to be a conservative professor, an Orthodox Catholic professor at what we will delicately call a historically Catholic university?
Well, it's a terrible time to be a professor. It's a terrible time to pursue truth. Although there was never a good time for it. So I have two kind of answers. I mean, one of them is, it's nothing. The chief feature of our declining culture is the recession of everyone into their own little hives. And so as this withdrawal continues, whether it's the withdrawal of the Benedict option or the withdrawal of people bowling alone or the withdrawal of people just not bowling anymore because that would involve getting off the couch, people are very, very isolated, and the academic life is no exception there. There isn't the kind of campus life, just as there isn't the kind of public and civil life in our age that there once was. And so the place of conflict in our society most of the time is, well, in large urban riots as people are destroying property, and social media. And I'm just not an important enough person for the outrageous things that I sometimes say on social media to really get much attention. So there's that. On the other hand, I published an article in the Wall Street Journal 2 years ago pointing out that my university was in the process of creating diversity questions that would seem to indicate that if you expressed an orthodox conception of simply a sane conception of sex and gender or the nature of marriage, that you might be found out and found in violation of Title IX, inclusiveness doctrines, et cetera, et cetera. And I published that in defense of academic freedom. The argument I articulated was in terms of academic freedom, um, because I was seeking to state the argument as most people in our relatively liberal, as in classically liberal, freedom-loving culture would want to express it, even though I think there's much more to be said about the need for an orthodox teaching to be taking place within every Catholic university, and not simply a sort of anything goes market of ideas, John Stuart Mill kind of liberalism. But nonetheless, it was Mill I used, as it were, as my interlocutor in explaining to the world why this was a really bad thing for the university, for my university, and for any university. And something like 150 to 200 of my colleagues thought, no, they really wanted to be repressed this way. So I have had petitions signed against me, but I just hardly noticed. I think it was spring. I was watching baseball.
I mean, you didn't make a big thing about it because I don't even, as far as I remember, I certainly don't remember. I remember, I think I maybe remember the article, but I don't remember the petition. So you clearly
Yeah.
weren't making yourself out to be a big victim or anything.
Yeah, well, I couldn't read through the whole petition because it was half literate. So, and I don't like to respond to things that I'm not willing to read. So I just, it's like putting down a really bad book. Why would that you've been assigned to review? I'm not going to write a review of this book. It's too bad to review it. Such alas is the ability of many of my colleagues. So there's that, and gosh, it. When you're dealing with college freshmen, it's true that I've spent the last 2 hours telling you that we have no culture, we have no civilization, we have an anti-culture, we're all falling apart. You would expect that to enter into the lives of young people, and it does. But it enters in a really precious and sad way with which I sympathize, and that is, young people have grown up not thinking, with a series of contradictions. Nobody can know the truth, but the sciences will give you an absolute sure-footed foundation for the truth that if everybody just listened to those things, everything would be fine. Even though, of course, science has nothing to say about any of the questions that actually matter in society. They have grown up believing that you've got to just follow your passions, even though none of them would ever dare follow a passion. They've grown up that make you happy, but also you're going to be an investment banker. They've grown up believing really that that the good is relative, and yet if you hurt somebody, that's absolutely bad. The harm principle that comes out of Mill. These are all a series of incoherencies with which they've been raised, and they may not sense the incoherence of it, but they do sense the unhappiness of it. They have no sense. Very few of them have any sense of the great adventure that it is to be alive. I just finished the novel Mr. Blue by Miles Connolly from 1928. I'm just writing a little essay on it, and Mr. Blue says at one point, "Life is so beautiful it sometimes frightens me." Our students have been told that life is frightening. Our young people have been told that life is frightening, but the fright that they've been given is the fright that they better not say the wrong thing or they'll be accused of being racist. The fright they've been given is they better study the right thing or they'll starve to death, even though we have a huge welfare state that dominates virtually every aspect of our society. They've been told that that really they just gotta be cautious and not do anything significant, and but be sure to do a little volunteer work on the side, and you will somehow survive the 80 years of your life without too much poverty, too much physical misery, and without too much stress or drama from having had to undergo the adventure of truth. And so, it's so sad for them. It's so sad for us all that that's the kind of person we're trying to create. Men without chests, or people who are just docile occupiers of a cubicle, obedient servants of Mark Zuckerberg. I don't know what you want to call it, but it's sad and it's not good. And it's hard to reach students like that. On the other hand, wow, when they realize for the first time, as some of them will do, the incoherence of the beliefs that have been inculcated into them, or conversely, when they realize for the first time that an idea about something like piety, or even the idea of beauty or truth, is worth thinking about, you can see somewhere in the faint glimmer in the eye that that something good has happened. And I don't think any teacher from Plato forward ever hoped to achieve more.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I remember you said something too about the nature of the high school educations a lot of these students receive. You said something about them coming from like high quality Catholic high
Oh
schools,
yes,
sort of secular Catholic high
yeah,
schools where
yeah,
they get good grades and they think they already kind of have looked at what you're going to show them and already dismissed it. Can you
yes,
say what
yeah.
you were saying there?
Oh, absolutely, yes. So that's a very specific demographic at my particular university where I jokingly jokingly and seriously just say Catholic high schools in New Jersey uh, where students have thought that they're being Catholic educated for their whole lives, but basically they know a couple words. They know the magisterium, and they know to be the best version of themselves, or something like that. And so when they enter the classroom, they seem to think they have a knowledge of things of which they have absolutely no clue whatsoever. And that's a particular nut that has to be cracked at my particular university. It's not a I'm sure I was complaining about it a year ago at the Catholic Artist Society, but uh, it's it could be a little bit more pleasant a problem to deal with than some of the ones with which we're confronted. But it certainly is a problem, and it's kind of sad to see.
I see. Well, thank you. So let's conclude with another poem, and it's the concluding poem in your book. It's a nice note to end on, and like the after dinner toast, it also contains a little bit of reference to some of the other things we've observed in the past year besides the quarantine.
Yes. Yes, the book originally was to end with the quarantine notebook. It's a long 15-part poem. It takes half the composes half the volume. But no sooner had I finished it in late May than I saw what had overtaken our country and was about to overtake our country. And I thought I had to make some kind of acknowledgement of that for the sake of the book. Otherwise, the book would already feel dated and it hasn't even been published yet. And for the need to say something. So this is a poem called When. When noisome crowds turn out to flood the beach, and with their flesh despoil all in reach. When some boy burns his hand and squeals in pain, only to touch it to the stove again. When waiting for a carousel at the park, you see pale tattooed bodies, purple dark. When this drunk stranger brags with all his force about his past adulteries and divorce. Will you look on it all just as you should, and in that sordid wreckage find the good? When you turn over leaves upon the vine, where lantern flies cling gorging each veined line. When great winds shake the trees and cut the power, leaving you in the darkness of the hour. When in the nursing home your mother dies, cut off from muttered prayers and useless cries. When every argument begets a roar and every careless thought erupts in war. Will you maintain what once was understood? That even now the world as such is good? And when they hunt him through the soaking heat, to leave him crumpled in a bloody street, and when behind calm eyes he seems to gloat and press his weight down, on another's throat. And when you see them standing calmly there, indifferent as his last word dies in air, and when the glass is cracked, the streets aflame, with no words spoken but that burning name, will you stand as the Lord of all once stood, and somehow say that things are very good?
James, thank you so much for returning to the show, and thank you for making the varied topics discussed here today more of a unity than I expected that they would be.
Well, I was glad to be here, Thomas. Thanks for having me again.
Okay, everybody, thank you for listening and or watching. And just a quick note, my recommendation of this book from Angelico Press does not constitute an endorsement of all of their volumes. In particular, I would exercise some caution when looking at the titles under the category of Christian esotericism on their website, but they do publish some good things. I've recommended some of their books in the past. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button and click the notification bell. If you like this content, bad word. Sorry, I apologize deeply. This discussion, and please consider also helping us out by going to catholicculture.org/donate/audio, as we rely entirely on donations to keep things going. Thanks for listening.